YouTube, welcome to my YouTube channel, Anna Bella, and today I am going to be reviewing the Netflix limited series Trainwreck Woodstock 99. Oh my goodness, this festival was a complete disconnection of everything, completely. It is only 3 episodes long, but my goodness, what a review have I got for you today. So, overall, we've got 3 episodes of Woodstock 99 Trainwreck. The first Woodstock happened in 1969, and it was a 3-day festival of peace and music. And it was on a farm, and there was very much a community atmosphere, and people were there to help and support each other out. The community had to end up feeding them because there wasn't enough food to go around, and it was very much a collective experience because the music reflected the socio-economic, political times. Everything was in place. It was counterculture coming through, the new age. People were very much aware of what communism, socialism, republicanism and capitalistic greed were, and this was the counter to that, by people coming together and supporting each other. To then try and have the same thing reflected in 1990 is a complete disaster. There was another Woodstock which celebrated the 25th anniversary of the original Woodstock that happened in 1969, and that was in 1994. It was 2 more days of peace and music. There were a host of security issues to do with the fencing because people who hadn't got tickets felt they could just come in, and they brought beer and alcohol, and there were deaths over the 2 days. So when it came to Woodstock 1999, what they decided they would move it to a retired Air Force base. This had consequences because it was 3 days. Over the 3 days, it was incredibly hot. It was a heat wave. Concrete gets really, really hot. And what they'd effectively done is they'd effectively locked in all of their attendees. But I feel that the organisers didn't understand 90s culture because they had bands like The Corn, Limp Bizkit, Fred Durst. All of these things didn't speak to peace and music. In fact, the 90s, the late 90s, was a time of incredible gender confusion. And I'm not talking about LGBT issues or transgender issues. I'm talking about masculinity and the place of males. They were very, very hyperly male, to counteract the fact that women were actually starting to A, outperform boys in school, and B, make more money than men. And America never really has sorted this issue out in its own psyche as a country. And this was having an impact. There's also the issue of the legend or myth of Woodstock with people from the 90s. People from the 90s, when they hear about Woodstock, all they hear about is free sex, free love and drugs, and no limits. They don't see it as a spirit of community coming together, being a counterculture, presenting something that is different from capitalistic greed or republicanism, or challenging the state, or being about civil rights, or promoting votes for women and women's movement like the original one supposedly did. 90s kids at this particular time looked back and thought, great, I'm going to have 3 days of sex and loads of drugs and I can do whatever I like and nobody is going to stop me. They didn't see it as part of promoting the left political agenda. In fact, they didn't even know what that was, the coming of community. It's like that woman got given the plastic bags and she was going to give them out and get young people to put the rubbish away. Not going to happen because they don't have the same we are all community, we are all part of a community mindset. They have an individualistic mindset. And I'm not saying that just the kids that attended this did, but that was the 90s. Everybody was an individual and they could do whatever they wanted as long as it didn't blur sort of breaking the law. Obviously, everybody thinks, oh, Woodstock, you could do whatever you want. You could walk around nude, you could do this, that, or the other. And unfortunately, what happened is the pop scene at the time was very masculine and hyper-masculine, with Fred Durst and Korn and Metallica and all these great bands that we all know and love. But it was also a time of angst because you had the Millennium Bug kicking off, you had lots of school shootings happening in America. It was a very difficult time to be a young person. in America and around the world, because commercialism had crept into so much of your childhood that you felt as an individual you weren't valued, you weren't seen unless you wore Nike, unless you wore the latest gear. And unfortunately, the organisers of Woodstock, A, didn't take this into consideration, and B, treated the acts far better than they did the people who attended, overpriced the food, wouldn't let young people take their own food in, so they had to buy. So it was kind of like this cross cultures. A lot of the young people wanted what happened in Woodstock in 1969 in 1999, and that didn't happen. And when that didn't happen, all you were left with was 90s angst, which unfortunately led to some really dodgy treatment of women and rape and inappropriate touching and walking around naked for women and not the guys. But that's not what happened in 1969. Everybody walked around, or some people did. So it was a whole different... You can't take values from the 1960s and apply them to the 90s. It's not going to work. And I feel that the organisers didn't really explicitly say to the young people that were attending, this was the plan. So there was no structure, because before people would have just picked it up. Whereas now, and then remember, this was before social media as well, so you couldn't just tweet, oh my goodness, somebody set this on fire. Oh my goodness, somebody's done this. Oh my goodness. So, I mean, if you stick young people there, you overprice the food, you don't treat them very well, they let them get heat exhaustion, you don't have clear piping, you have drinking water that's infected by poop, because that's what happened. It was just awful. They didn't take into consideration the basics for a festival, which is you've got to make sure that there's enough food and drink and stuff that's reasonably priced for everybody. You've got to make sure that your human waste disposal system is separate from your drinking water and the showers. You've got to make sure that your attendees aren't overheating. And unfortunately, they didn't do that. They didn't look after them enough. And I know from the original Woodstock, people would support each other and look after each other and have the skills to support. 90s kids didn't have those skills because they just didn't. It's a whole different generation. You cannot apply one values from a previous generation to a current generation and expect them to mesh. They won't, because the issues that one generation is facing is very different to another generation. And to be absolutely honest, I think every generation has got to deal with how it's going to cope with racism, how it's going to cope with sexism, how it's going to cope with all of these isms and minority groups. How are they going to find a way to get their voice heard? Each generation has to resolve those internal issues themselves. It's almost like rediscovering it, and then once they've got that in the place and said, no, that's wrong, they can move forward again. Each generation has to resolve that own conflict. They cannot rely on something that the previous generation has done, because it can be easily undone once it's done. So just because you've got an Equalities Act or a Human Rights Act doesn't necessarily mean that another generation is going to change it or chop it or cut it about. You have to. Each generation's got to sort it out. And unfortunately, the organisers took too much for granted, I think. They didn't respect the young people enough, or they didn't give them the tools to enable them to exist in a supportive environment. And also, I felt that it was a bit of a money grab, to be absolutely honest. And they didn't really explain it enough. And I think that you could tell that from how it was done. I really enjoyed the 3 episodes, but it just didn't reflect. It was like so alien, because you had concepts of the 90s had crept in with the capitalism and the market and the hiking of the food, but then you also had people saying, oh, we should all collect the litter, but the litter bins weren't emptied enough, so it was all done on the cheap. Except the acts were treated really well and got free shoes from sponsors. So it's very, very strange, and it was just a disaster. And that was before everybody got really angsty and started lighting stuff on fire, or the rape van. I mean, that was just people, yeah, it was just completely different culture, because people didn't value each other. They didn't see each other as people. They saw each other as commodities. And that's because there was so much capitalism and greed and how people perceive each other and how men perceive women. And that was how it was reflected. And you can't sort of take those concepts away once they've been given them. You have to teach them, actually, you need to be respectful to each other, because man's planting is not the way forward. If you're a man, you've got to be so careful now. But overall, I give it 5 out of 5. It was very interesting to watch and to understand. But I mean, my goodness, it's a wonder nobody was actually killed at it in 1999. And I'm shocked that after 1994, where people did die, that they were actually allowed to do a third Woodstock, because I don't think they ever would be able to do it again, because you've got the welfare of your guests to consider. Everything's different now. You can't just rely on people, oh, they'll come together as a community and support each other and make sure everybody gets fed and is housed. That's not how it works. If you put on an event, you have to make sure that they have a tent and have access to clean water to drink and a little bit of food and good sanitation. So, well, I hope you enjoyed my review of the Netflix limited series Trainwreck Woodstock 1999. It was a complete disconnection between the older generations and the younger generations, but actually Woodstock 1999 really reflected the 90s perfectly. Absolutely. You had the angst, you had the bands, you had the greed, corporate greed and capitalism. It's perfectly encapsulated in this 3-episode series. Don't forget to click the notification bell for my latest video, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and let me know what you thought about this documentary in the comments below. We're hoping that you're staying safe wherever you are, and thank you for the support. Bye!